Hi, guys. Thank you so much for taking your time to see me first. That's awesome. Hopefully I don't put you to sleep about talking about designing around legislation. This is actually really fun. I've made versions of this talk for web development. I've made versions of this talk for VR and AR. And this is the first crack at Android. So again, thanks for bearing with me. The topic is developing apps with privacy in mind as a baseline need. And I'll get into all the nuances as to how to ground yourself with a couple frameworks, some legal, like a legislation that recently went into effect that I'll talk about. But I'm actually going to do something unconventional. My wife warned me not to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway with how I introduce myself. First, I'm a Google developers expert for product strategy. And Google still hasn't really figured out what to do with the product strategy experts, so they just dump us into design. But as you know, we product guys, girls, or people just manage the life cycle, just get close to the user, are empathic to the needs, solving problems or sniffing out problems for other people to solve so we look good. I do this at my day job at NDI, the National Democratic Institute, where I manage a product line. I own a product line of about half dozen open source solutions in various stages of maturity. As part of that, I kind of stuck my foot in my mouth and said, raised the flag when I was interviewing for that job last year and asked them about their readiness for the GDPR. And no one had ever heard of that before. What was even more frightening was that no one had ever heard of it in the international development community as far as the ones that operate in the United States that were funded by the same mechanisms as NDI. That's talking about IFIS, if you've ever heard of IFIS, USAID, the International Republican Institute, IRI, and we are part of a consortium, and we work together to help change lives around the world. So I appointed myself Data Protection Officer, DPO, in addition to my other responsibilities. So that's me. And next to me, this is where my wife sort of thought it was going to get weird. That's my little daughter, and she's there for a reason. Before I get into that, if you have any feedback as to how this talk is going, good or bad, I'm a product manager. I have a very thick skin. Definitely tweet at me, hashtag Android Summit. Is that what we're using? Android Summit 2018 with that hashtag in front. So I'm beginning with Sparrow because I'd like to sort of ground us with why privacy matters, why being good stewards of users' data matters. Sparrow is my daughter. She goes to a Montessori school out in Alexandria, Virginia. She's 4 years old. I put her in the care of total strangers, teachers, educators. I say, teach her, feed her, show her a good time. That is the agreement. I am the parent. So if they want to do anything other than that, like feed her something that I'm not aware of, or take her to the zoo, or give a new curriculum that I don't think I agree with, or maybe I'm all for, I need to sign off on that. I'm the parent. That is the agreement. It is through that lens that the EU, years ago, thought about data privacy. Facebook. I have interest and a need to connect with my friends. This is my name, my email. Use it. Connect me with my community and my friends. However, don't do more than that. I know you this is a free service and you want to get paid, so sure. Advertisement, use my data to make money so I can keep connecting with mom and dad. So if you do something other than that, like change elections and stuff like that, let me know. Today's goals, the objectives today, if you take two things away, hopefully, I want to sort of illuminate why these boring subjects like GDPR matters with everything that we do. And then take from that some examples, picking on Facebook here and there, or other companies here and there. I'll even use examples from some of the work that my team has been working on. So why is it a big deal? For the EU, it unifies the definitions of data protection. I'll give you an example. In the United States, 50 states, there are 48 different definitions of data privacy. And that is a problem as far as governance is concerned. The EU's GDPR legislation, some legal speak people call it a long-arm jurisdiction, right? Kind of like long-arm in the sense that if I were to hop in a car and go to Florida right now and someone threatened me and I shot him, I could say, I could stand your ground. It's kind of weird, but it's a long-arm jurisdiction, meaning if you want to operate in the the European Union, if you want to do business with residents that live there, you have to be in compliance. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, you do not have to be an EU company. And so it's a big deal. It is one of the most, it's the craziest legislation with a good heart. But it's also kind of out there. Because even as of May 25th, most of the legislative bodies that were in charge of mandating the GDPR, Germany included, were not ready, right? So it's new, but it comes from a good place. Why does it matter? In the world today, we all know there's a massive amounts of data. We coin it sometimes when we use that data in our design work, we call it, in order to inform our design work rather, we call it big data. Data, when mutated and analyzed, can do many things, but in the wrong hands can be dangerous. And our legislators are taking note because it is changing our lives, our societies, the water we drink, the air we breathe. It is our human right. Those in the EU may have a point. And surely enough, it is long-arm enough, using that legal speak, that Canada is passing a similar law. California, that country out west, is passing a similar law. And all of those are long-arm as well. So if you want to do business and operate in those countries, you have to be in compliance. And there are more following. Some stricter, some just watching, but will enact something later. Federal government has some stuff in the hopper. But all this comes to a nexus, depending on your perspective, of a burden or an opportunity, right? It's a burden to go through all the legal hoops and all the privacy promise snack bars that you have to sort of think through at the beginning of each sprint that you're cracking at before shipping it on May 25th, 2018. That part of this talk was given before 2018, so. But anyway, there's an opportunity there. Long gone is the day where, because I, as a developer, designer, company, is offering a free service to you, that I expect my users to give up their data, their privacy. That's a zero-sum approach. We should think about this as a positive sum approach where our users are not sacrificing their privacy at the expense of the service that we're providing. I won't dwell too much on this. If you don't know anything about GDPR, full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer. Don't aspire to be either. You can definitely look at this. But if you were to hop on anyone here, if you're an EU resident citizen or an American citizen, if you were to hop on a flight from BWI or IAD and landed at LHR tomorrow, stayed there for a week, you are an EU resident. And you have superpowers. These are 4 of them. You have the superpower to be asked, to get a justification as to why the service needs your data. They need to provide you consent, and I'll get into that in a second. You need to provide them, you as the developer or designer needs to provide your audience information when they need it. So access to that information, allow them to edit or control that data. Next, the ability to just delete any information that you may have on them that they may not want. And then last is more on the governance, the monitoring and evaluation part of it, security by design. For years, we've always valued backing up our files, but perhaps baking in privacy by design and security by design is the world that we live in today, and it is an opportunity. It builds trust. All this should be baked into your design process. At every stage of your design process, or even your happy path, if you want to look at it that way. So at the very top row, you have different stages of the experience of your application. There's some data privacy and transparency considerations to think through and test as hypotheses or experiments, and bake that into the entire process as you go from the problem space, where you're empathizing and understanding the problem, to that solution space. And of course, I'm a PM, so I live in the data, so measure, right? And at the bottom here, you have ways to measure either quantitatively or qualitatively along the way, and test it. Because often it's going to be kind of hard to context switch from, for example, with a user who's only known on the internet, on a mobile device, a checkbox that says, you agree to my privacy, and a link that they never click. It is the most challenging to collect consent by thinking up another creative way to do it, because that just creates more cognitive load, and maybe they're not used to it yet. They just want to access the content. So I'll get into something designers call progressive disclosure. You've seen it in some games here in a second, but you can adapt that sort of thinking to how your happy path sort of works for the different stages of your experience. I'm using this example to pick on Facebook a little bit. They identified a need. I'm sure they have an army of researchers. They identified a need that when I have a picture taken of me without me knowing, I want to be notified so that I can revel in my handsome good looks, or frown because they didn't get the good side of me, or I'm just, I don't want to be associated with whoever took the picture. It's a great problem. Like, I certainly want to know that I was walking by the monument and someone took a picture and here I am. That's surely me. I was there as well. And they're applying computer vision to this. And I don't know how the sausage is being made, but these are considerations that they're going to have to make. One, they're going to have to give you a clear reason why they need your information. Convince me earn my trust in order to provide that technology to fit that solution? Well, start with why. Always, I keep bringing this up because it's a positive sun. That actually builds trust in my, and actually builds your acquisition if you're tracking that, or your activation metrics if you're tracking that. And I know often we sort of have this thing where we just have the legal team, or we just go on like LegalZoom or whatever and just copy pasta content into our privacy documents because you can't ship on the Android store without having it, right? We all do it. But you can't do that anymore with the EU legislation if you want to serve an EU resident. And again, it's not an EU citizen, it is an EU resident, meaning I could be an EU resident tomorrow. So you have to write clearly stated reasons in English, not legalese, as to what the terms and conditions are. And you can do this progressively, right, when you need it. You do not need to just bombard them on that onboarding experience. Actually, it is bad design, right? You want to progressively collect a phone number when the feature affords the user with contacting someone via SMS, for example. And only then. There's no need to have that form in the beginning, that registration form that has every single piece under the world. At NDI, the National Democratic Institute, we have a social media monitoring solution. This is a mock-up of it. And essentially, we serve a need for media monitors who happen to focus also on social media to understand what their party members and or opposing party members are saying before, during, and after an election. And we tap into this Twitter streaming API, which actually broke yesterday because we were using the old one. But by show of hands, who feels in order to use that information that we collect, say, name or email? Yeah, there's no need, right? It is social media information, right? And it's then and only then that we need to be able to save their historical searches. So say I search for disinformation, I progressively would say, oh, I want to save my search for, women's rights, and I got my analysis, but I want to come back to it, and I hit save. Maybe that's a good time to then ask for a name. But make it clear when you do that. This is a complex approach to it. This has been simplified quite a bit. But this gives you a clearly written terms of service where you're essentially boiling down what you're trying to say in legalese into just clear visual mediums with easy ways to accept it. Next, we have to give users agency over that data. So back to that Facebook example. Yeah, there was great need for it, but now I know that Facebook has compiled a bunch of, pictures of myself, right? And I appreciate it. Well, one bit of agency that I would like to have is to be able to revoke, well, there's a philosophical debate as to who owns that picture if I'm in it, right? But if you read Facebook's terms of service, which I haven't, I use the service every day. Actually, Facebook owns it, apparently, the picture. And so they get to pick and choose, and actually makes it easier for them to have governance on it. But just let me know. Let me know what I can do and why. And the market will be able to determine whether that's a good decision or not. I tried to find a way to find my information on WhatsApp yesterday. Popular Android app. I went in, nowhere to be found. I had an option, I could delete my account. So right to erasure is a checkbox that I can sort of tick. But if anyone can figure it, this slide is here because I really do need to know. And so if anybody can help me out, they don't have a good support. So I've talked about progressive disclosure. I'll give another example. So we're familiar with video games, Candy Crush. I have never played Candy Crush, so I'm gonna go with it anyway. So, don't start. So I imagine a game like Candy Crush would employ progressive disclosure as part of the user experience, in the sense that they're not going to just bombard you with pages and pages of text showing you how to play the game, nor will they sort of give you a little dialogue pop-up when you first download the game to tell you, if you want to do this, do that. Progressively, as you go through engaging with the content, with the game, you might, if somebody remembers, you might see that little cartoon finger just waving, doing a swipe motion, and just go away. Because contextually, the developer and the designer understand through quantitative analysis, maybe your mixed panel data or your Firebase or Google, I guess it's a Google event, so I should say Google or Firebase analytics data, that when people normally get here, there's a large drop-off. So maybe that's when you use that data to inform that experience, that progressive disclosure. Disclose progressively how to get past this little block, because I have the data. Another example would be that is actually in practice. So one example was in practice already. We see it with games all the time. Another example is more UI-centered progressive disclosure, where you don't want to clutter. I talked about that little long registration form that we're used to. We're in DC here, so we've seen government forms before. In this case, I don't really need the user's information in order to get rating data. But if they liked it or didn't like it and they still want to reach out, they have the option of providing this information. And this image it's actually a GIF. It's not animating, but the credit goes to someone on Dribble. I have no idea. Moving from that, agency of my data, right? Right to access, right to erasure, right to deletion. I should also have the right to liberate my information. And years ago, Google had this initiative called the Data Liberation Front. It was awesome. They had like logos, and they were like the pirates and band of pirates at Google that were just not following the rules and, keeping the large corporation mothership honest. And a lot of their efforts went into what became Google Takeout. And maybe Takeout is still a thing, which basically was a way to export the contents of your data at any point. I mean, that is awesome. That is extreme, but that may not be something that everyone can do, but you can sort of work towards that level of transparency with the data. Unfortunately for you, you have to do it if you want to deal with a resident of the EU. Finally, the number 4 in that list of things that you have to be aware of was governance or security or monitoring. Again, I'm not going to tell you how to do that. Luckily, on the framework side, on the Android side, Firebase has a lot of tools available at your disposal. I'm familiar with Firebase, so I'll use that as my example. You can even go as far as setting your company's data protection officer as a setting in there. So if there's an injunction, unfortunately, or if there's a complaint. I should mention about the penalties of not being in compliance, because I have not mentioned that. So 4% of your annual revenue, or 20 million euros, is the penalty. That is a death sentence to a lot of startups, and doesn't even take in consideration the brand hit for not just you, but your data processors and your partners and your investors if you're funded. And so having privacy by design sort of baked in as a baseline need. When you're going through your acceptance criteria, we look at our test coverage with our unit tests, and we look at, functionality and usability and reliability and performance and supportability. Where does privacy and security fit in as far as that acceptance criteria? Right. So I'm going to start wrapping up with some, and I'll leave, looks like I'll have some time for questions, which is awesome. Start thinking about your questions. With some resources, Android P and even an Oreo sort of made some strides. I don't know whether it was due to global pressures and legislations. I know for sure it was based on that one slide that had that Venn diagram. The world is changing. We need to look at being good stewards of user data as part of what we do. And so as part of that, Android released some privacy-focused features where they started blocking access to the camera in the background. You now have to figure out a creative way to do what you needed to do with that feature. And if you have to do what you need to do, I used to work at Upskill, it was Apex then. We were essentially a camera company, right? We couldn't do a lot of what we did without the camera. And so the challenge now, I'm sure I'm no longer there, is to try to, be transparent with their customers, the enterprise customers, and fully disclose how that data is going to be used. And then next, looking at some options. I'm sure there's a talk or two about Jetpack, so you can eliminate boilerplate in your code. There's some permissions features that they point to that I honestly don't, I'm not an Android developer, just in case you haven't noticed. But you've got Jetpack, and it's got some resources to help you. You've got Material IO, if that is the design standard that you adhere to, if you use another framework or you have your own. Think about how to gracefully sort of present your promise to privacy. Contextually maybe, at the right time, and then stay out of the way when the user doesn't expect it. And these are, I didn't cover all of these, but these are essentially the core tenets. I lived here today, but essentially, if you want to adhere to the principles, I'll make the slide available. You have to be proactive, not reactive. Especially if you get a complaint. By law, you have to respond in 72 hours. So you have a data breach on Friday. By Monday, you better be ready to tell the governing body and the user what happened and how you plan on fixing it. If there are any questions with that, do raise them. So that's pretty much where we are. Is it a burden to be good stewards of user data? Or do we see ourselves in that on the flip side when we're designing beautiful Android experiences? I think being progressive with how you present information and when you collect information, actually it's good UX, it's good user experience. It's a good user experience. Can't speak today. And sort of collecting all that information at once is really not necessary. Using data to your advantage while being transparent can actually gain you more trust and gain you better usability. Some additional resources. Firebase went full bore on the GDPR thing. They have ways to sort of have governance over your data and sort of comply to right to erasure, right to access, and right to deletion. And this is my information. If you want to hear more about this, I write about this on Medium. I post those to Twitter. I've since stopped using YouTube, but I'd like to do more of that. So if you visit it and you add me to YouTube, maybe I'll do a video. And I am decently active on GitHub. Thank you. I was 34 minutes, leaving ample time, 10 minutes for questions. Boy, am I ready for you guys. So start bringing it. I haven't, but I would love to. Oh, it makes sense with that.
Before I watched that video, I mean, I thought I did, but I really didn't until I watched that video. It's like a whole different take on the value of it, the importance. And I think, like as designers and product owners, that, and just as citizens, just as human beings,
right.
It's really, really good take on it too.
Right. Another resource, and she's the godmother of privacy by design, Dr. Anne Kevorkian. Can't pronounce her name. She has some great talks as well. I don't know whether she's ever done a TED Talk, but those last principles that I highlighted, my clicker's not working now, were based on her work years ago before GDPR was cool. Anne Kevorkian. Yeah.
Noticed recent medical experiences where the HIPAA, which was originally designed to protect your patient privacy, make the way the major organizations have structured the hospitals primarily, make it almost impossible for you to get your own data because they've instituted the data protection to where you have to jump through so many hoops. It becomes very, very difficult. I wondered if and GPDR is just in the beginning. Do you see that sort of kind of perversion of the intent, and do you see paths of that happening, or is it just too much in its infancy now to see that sort of trend where the intent is kind of hijacked?
Right. It's a good question. So the difference between, I'll start here, the difference between HIPAA and other legislations that have gone into effect and GDPR is that where HIPAA was protecting the systems that govern the private use or the secure and private use of our data, GDPR flipped that on its head, whereby the individual, the human, was afforded those rights. So you'll notice that the GDPR is written to power shift it from the organizational bodies who are responsible to giving me the power to make them responsible, right? And it's catching on, right? There's a California legislation that is often called GDPR Light that only focuses on the consent part, which is fantastic. And the thought process with the readings that I saw was that we already have federal laws, like we had HIPAA and some legislation to sort of handle governance, and maybe deletion and access was just too crazy, too European. So they honed in on consent, meaning that now with my data in some EHR or electronic medical system, I now have, if I'm a California resident, I have the superpowers to ask for that data, right? And so, whereas the U.S. is a little, that's what we love about America. We have states that govern, and then we decide we need a federal law to sort of rule them all if it's easier. I think when you start looking at private information, sensitive information sometimes as a human right, it is a long-arm thing, and it has to be from the federal government. But then again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't really understand that. Another thing that I want to sort of add to, I've mentioned privacy. I didn't want to get into the weeds too much, but I've nerded out way too much on this for way too long. But what is private data? And I mentioned that in the US we call private information, or PII, personally identifiable information. We have so many different definitions of it. But one advantage in the EU, and what Canada is also working on, is to sort of unify those definitions, which makes it easier to govern around them, make it easier to access your information and whatnot. The EU defines personal information as one or more of name, email, social security number or national ID, photos, social media information, my child's information, and it just cascades on and on and on and on and on. Sensitive information is not covered by the GDPR, but implied. So sensitive information will be classified as my race, my religious abilities. And then there's some gray areas. Is my health information sensitive or private? Well, GDPR calls it private, so it goes under the PII bucket. But it really matters if you have an app that you're designing for, and you decide, oh, well, this is an event app, and my customer is going to, it's a B2B app, I'm just making this up. My customers are going to want to sort of, collect dietary restrictions, like, I'm going to feed you at this Android Summit, and you're going to register through my app, and I'm going to want to ask you if you're allergic to some foods, right? Well, that's health information. And is it sensitive? Is it not? They classified it as sensitive, but then my race isn't. It's kind of weird. Yeah. Any other questions? I'll ask you guys. With show of hands, how many people actually worked on wrapping their heads around or actually actively developing solutions for privacy compliance? Wow. And was it a chore? Was it an opportunity from a strategic standpoint?
For me, it was because it was from the ground up, and we started development after GDPR. We designed within privacy in mind from the get-go.
Right.
The user can say, I don't want any kind of identifiable information it's mostly for logging and error.
Right.
Yeah, they can say we don't want it, and because there was nothing there to deal with the legacy code, just put it in as a default.
You got 2 minutes. I can take one question because I speak a lot. No more questions? Awesome. Well, thank you.